Okay, so we've got a really interesting set of ideas to dive into today, all centered around this. I mean, it feels like it's the topic of the moment, right? Wealth inequality, specifically in the UK and the US. And what we're really going to try and unpack is, what's causing it? Are there solutions? And we've got these two, I guess you could call them opposing voices in a way. Gary Stevenson, he's the former trader, right? The guy who made a good amount of money, let's just say, betting against, well, economic stability.
Yeah.
And then we have Daniel Priestley, who's coming at it from, the entrepreneurial side, built a bunch of businesses. So I'm really interested to see where they land on this, on why so many people feel like they're getting squeezed and if there's anything that can actually be done about it.
Yeah. And you see that difference right away in the way they frame the problem.
Hmm.
Gary Stevenson, he comes out swinging a bit. You can tell he's frustrated,
Hmm.
especially with this idea that, if people are struggling, they just need to be more entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
I mean, he even references his own video, the one about the whole rich dad thing, right? It's
Yeah.
like, come on, that's not the reality for most people. He's really focused on the day-to-day struggles, people who are literally having trouble just affording the basics.
Absolutely. It's like he's saying, let's get real here. This is what people are actually dealing with.
Exactly. And then you have Daniel Priestley, and he's coming at it from a totally different angle. For him, it's about, well, he talks a lot about big government,
Right.
high taxes being a major problem,
Yeah.
the education system not keeping up. And then you've got, all the changes with technology and remote work disrupting everything. So it's like right off the bat, they're diagnosing the problem in two very different ways.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Stevenson, he really pushes back hard. Like he's absolutely convinced that the core issue, it's the growing gap between the rich and everyone else. And he keeps coming back to this idea that, the system is kind of rigged, right? Where the more the wealthy gain, the more everyone else seems to lose out. And you can see how he makes that connection, especially when things like, housing prices are going up way faster than wages.
Yeah, like it's a zero-sum game almost.
Exactly. And then his solution, I mean, it's pretty bold. Tax cuts for working people paid for by raising taxes on, well, the top earners.
Which, of course, is not going to sit well with someone like Priestley. He basically says, hold on a second. That's way too simplistic.
Yeah.
You got to think about the consequences. Like, he's worried about all these millionaires leaving, and his point is, if they go, they take their money with them. And guess what? That means less tax revenue overall.
Yeah, and he's basically saying that could end up hurting the very people Stevenson is trying to help, right?
Exactly. The argument being that, you need the wealthy to contribute to the system to work for everyone.
Right. But then Stevenson brings in this pretty compelling personal story. I mean, he talks about making a ton of money betting on, and this is his term, the collapse of Western society.
Oh.
And he says he did it not just once, but twice. And now he's like, okay, I've made my money, but I'm actually trying to stop that collapse from happening.
So he's trying to prevent the very thing he profited from.
Yeah. And to make his point, he even brings up, what he's seen in places like South Africa and Nigeria, these countries with crazy levels of inequality. And it's like he's holding that up as a warning, like, this is where the UK and the US could be headed if we don't change course.
It's a pretty stark picture.
It is. It's pretty intense. And then, Priestley, he brings in his own background. He talks about growing up in this part of Australia, lots of unemployment, not many opportunities. He goes through his, first jobs, kind of bouncing around. And then he finds entrepreneurship and, well, he's obviously done pretty well for himself. But what's interesting is he's also worried about inequality, but he thinks the UK, it's more like he uses India as an example.
Interesting. So they both see a problem, but their reference points are completely different.
Yeah, and then he makes this really fascinating observation about, the cultural differences between the UK and the US. He says, like, in the UK, there's this historical thing, right, where people, they blame the rich for economic problems. He talks about landlords and the aristocracy, like it's baked into the culture.
That's a good point.
Right. And then in the US, he's saying it's more about this deep distrust of government. People want the government to just, stay out of things.
Like less interference, more freedom.
Exactly. And he even brings up that Rich Men North of Richmond song, which I guess is kind of tapping into that sentiment.
Yeah, it's like a cultural touchstone for that whole anti-establishment feeling.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to some specific economic events. Starting with, I mean, we can't really talk about this without talking about COVID, right? The pandemic and all the government spending that came with it. And this is actually one area where both Stevenson and Priestley, they agree something big happened.
Right, a major turning point.
Yeah. Stevenson, he talks about, making those bets right at the beginning of COVID. He was anticipating what would happen with all the money printing, governments pumping money into the economy.
Which, just to clarify, that's basically the central bank increasing the amount of money in circulation.
Yeah.
It can lead to, inflation is the big one, but it also affects things like asset prices.
Right. And Stevenson's point is that, it was meant to help people who were struggling, but a lot of that money, it ended up flowing to the wealthy, the people who could, sit tight, save, and invest during the lockdowns.
It's like, however well-intentioned the policies were, the way the system is structured, a big chunk of that money ended up in the hands of people who already had assets.
Exactly. And Priestley, he's looking at this period through a slightly different lens. He's talking about the explosion of the digital economy, like how much entrepreneurial activity happened online
Right.
and how much investment poured into tech companies. So both of them see this massive shift happening, but they're focused on different parts of it.
Yeah, different perspectives on the same event.
Okay, so another thing that was happening during this time, well, it was already happening, but it really accelerated during COVID, is the whole housing situation. I mean, it's a crisis, right? And Priestley, he brings up this idea of a housing traffic jam.
A housing traffic jam.
Yeah, his term. He's talking about, all these houses with extra bedrooms sitting empty, mostly owned by baby boomers. And he makes the point that this generation, they benefited from low interest rates and, being able to borrow more easily.
Right, so they were able to get on the property ladder in a way that's just not possible for a lot of people today.
Yeah. And Stevenson, he jumps in and says, okay, so house prices have gone up, but that doesn't mean these homeowners have all this extra cash just lying around.
Right, it's not like they could just easily access that wealth.
Exactly. And this actually leads to a really fundamental disagreement between them. They're basically arguing about whether it's, acceptable for younger generations to potentially never own anything. Like, are we okay with a future where home ownership is just out of reach for most people?
Wow, yeah, that's a huge question.
It is. And Priestley, he seems more focused on finding ways to make the economy grow, create more opportunities. But Stevenson, he's like, no, this is a fundamental problem with how wealth is distributed.
Yeah, and it really highlights the difference in their, I guess you could say, their worldviews.
Right. And then Priestley, he makes this distinction between, he calls it wealth extraction and wealth creation.
Okay, interesting. What's the difference?
So wealth extraction, he sees that as, stuff like trading, which is, of course, what Stevenson did. It's basically just moving existing wealth around. But wealth creation, that's about actually generating new value, like starting businesses, coming up with innovations. And Priestley, he really believes that things like high taxes, they get in the way of that. He says they choke off economic freedom.
So he's all about creating the right conditions for entrepreneurship to flourish.
Exactly. And this is where their views on taxes, I mean, they totally clash.
Yeah, this seems to be a major point of contention.
It is. Stevenson, he's like, okay, if the economy isn't growing that much overall, where is all this extra wealth coming from? And Priestley's response is basically, well, look at me. I built these tech companies.
So he's saying, my wealth is a result of creating something new, not just extracting it from somewhere else.
Right. But at the core, it's this disagreement about what taxes do. Priestley, he's all about lower taxes, smaller government. He thinks that leads to more economic freedom, which then leads to less poverty. And he even brings in these economic freedom indices.
Oh, yeah, those are like rankings of countries based on how free their economies are. Things like property rights, regulations, how big the government is.
Right. And he says there's a direct link between those scores and poverty rates. And he even uses India as an example, saying that when they liberalized their economy, poverty went down. And then he points out that the UK, it's actually been dropping in the rankings.
So he's implying that the UK is becoming less economically free.
Exactly. But Stevenson, he comes back with this almost opposite view. He's saying that countries like the UK and the US, they've actually created more poverty by having less economic freedom.
So it's like they're looking at the same data,
Yeah.
but interpreting it in completely different ways.
Yeah, and for Stevenson, it all comes back to, the rich having too much power, too much influence.
And then Priestley brings up this whole thing about millionaires leaving the UK.
Oh, right, the millionaire exodus.
Yeah, and he ties it directly back to his point about economic freedom. He's saying that the UK is becoming a less attractive place for wealthy people, and he even points to the changes in those non-dom tax rules.
Right, those rules that allowed some wealthy residents to avoid paying UK tax on their foreign income.